Kia ora and welcome to another episode of the Niche Cast. We have just recorded our second episode of the Almost Daily Black Caps podcast. This is the first episode, though, that is just on Patreon. So we did a good 45 minutes on the Black Caps just after day one, and that is on our Patreon page. So if you are a Patreon listening to this episode of the Niche Cast, do jump onto Patreon and have a listen, have a gander at that episode. And if you do want a little bit of Black Caps Almost Daily podcast action and to be in favor of the karmic forces of gratitude and abundance in supporting the Niche Cage, do join Patreon. It is the best way to support the Niche Cage. So you get your karma points up, you get your karma boost, and then you also get the Almost Daily podcast that we do on Patreon, currently doing the Black Caps tour of England. So check all those out. We do have our Substack email, Substack/LNicheCache, EL Nichecache. Patreon is patreon.com/LNicheCache as well, EL Nichecache. And we'll be sending out an email dispatch with different bits and pieces tomorrow, Friday, maybe today, the time of your listening. And we're always writing about Kiwi sports at the niche-cache.com. Wobbly Wildcard, what do you have in your basket of mindfulness to start the Niche Cast episode here with us right now? Let's go!
Yeah, let's call this one a Devon Conway-inspired one, I think. Going to everyone's favourite Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius, says, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one."
So you're saying Devon Conway just gets out there and he just be's a good man?
Doesn't yap away, just does the job. Gets out there and does what needs doing. Scores 100 on Test debut at Lords on day one on a wicket that was nipping around a little bit. Don't overthink it. Just go out there and do what you need to do.
My mind is exploding with Black Caps thoughts, but as we have discussed, there are plenty of Black Caps thoughts on the Almost Daily Black Caps podcast on the Patreon page. Today we're going to just catch up with some other Kiwi sports business, and I do have a jumping off point for us here, Wildcard. Maybe it's a diving platform 10 meters above the air from which I'm going to do a triple somersault into the pool and ask you about your vibe of the 2021 Olympics. Apparently it's around the corner, and I do not know. I'm skeptical, I'm dubious, I am cautious in investing energy into the Olympics because I just don't we're in some crazy times that I think actually getting crazier, if I might digress. You look at what's happening in the NRL, you've got a bit of a divide between the player base and the media, not necessarily the head honcho Peter V'landys, but you've got Fox League. There's a massive gap between the players and the media in the NRL that I think is simmering. America's kicking off because all the fan stuff that we're seeing in the NBA, that just seems like a continuation of the racial situation in USA and just the kerfuffle that they are in over there. I'm saying, using those two things as an example, that I still think the world is pretty crazy right now. It just might not seem as crazy as it once did. I am very dubious about the Olympics right now, Wildcard. And obviously Kiwi sport, a lot of it revolves around the Olympics. We just had Black Sticks hockey games that are in preparation for the Olympics. There's a massive football element to the Olympics. I don't think we've got any basketball in the Olympics, but you do have, I think, Paige Hareb is looking to seal an Olympic surfing spot, I believe, over in El Salvador. Athletics, let alone any other sport that we don't really cover. Olympics is huge for New Zealand sport, and I'm very curious, Wildcard, just to catch your vibe on the vibe coming from the Olympics, which is the Japanese Tokyo Olympics. Meant to be last year, locked in for this year. is it going to happen? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, the 2020 Tokyo Olympics being held in 2021 when Tokyo don't actually want it anymore. It's I have actually followed a fair bit of this because there's some interesting kind of like political background to it where apparently there is like, obviously for obvious reasons, the populace of Tokyo don't really want a massive inswell of overseas athletes coming into their city and potentially causing another wave of coronavirus-y stuff. I would imagine you'd get the IOC under pretty tight controls there. I don't think that's something that's too likely to actually happen, but I do think that you can obviously understand why there would be tensions among the citizens there. And because of that, apparently there's like the general elections later this year. So if the people are in a bit of a kerfuffle about not really wanting it, then the politicians are only going to play that angle up because they're all trying to get re-elected, right? So there's that whole thing, which has led to a pretty firm kind of, it seems, kind of denial of the thing. Like Japan, Tokyo, they basically just don't want to host these Olympics, but they've signed contracts and there's extremely difficult to get out of. And you know how organizations like the IOC and FIFA would be another one. We know how they like to operate these things. And when you are hosting the Olympics, you basically kind of like give up sovereignty of a small section of your country for a month at a time. And the IOC just comes in and runs everything. So I don't know that Tokyo even really has a say. So I would be absolutely stunned if the Olympics don't go ahead. I think it's almost completely certain, like something absolutely drastic would have to happen for it not to happen, because it's the IOC and we know how they're going to operate. We know what their priorities are going to be. They've already delayed it once. I don't think they'd delay it again. And I do think actually they could probably get a decent... we've seen enough good examples of how to operate these kind of events within bubbles and with good vaccination processes and all this. I think you can probably get away with it. It's going to be weird though. It's going to be extremely strange, especially because like the fan aspect, there's not going to be a whole lot of support going on, which like a closed door Olympics is a bit weird, but I do think it'll go ahead. My excitement levels are mostly limited to the football stuff at the moment because there's just like interesting ideas about how both the men's and women's teams are going to be like arranged, who's going to be selected, a couple injuries to consider and things like that. And also just because it's an opportunity to see national football representative teams at a time when there has not been hardly any of that for a long time. So that has captivated me. The rest of it, I've sort of kept an eye on, like who might be selected, who might be missing out, and all those kind of things. But I can't say I've put too much focus on any of it. It would be sort of like when everything's finalized, I think then I'll probably click into gear a little bit more. But at the moment, it's just sort of one more thing on the horizon that's happening in the future that I don't necessarily have to worry about quite yet.
Do you have a date on when that's meant to start? It's like July.
The Olympics, mid-late July or something like that, isn't it?
It's at least
a month away, I'm pretty sure.
There you go.
23rd of July.
Can't wait for that opening ceremony. Going to definitely stay up late and catch the extravaganza. That is going to be whatever the fuck it's going to be. Who knows?
I don't know how they're going to do that part of it, eh? They've already like sort of compromised with the torch run a bit, haven't they? I don't think they're fully going through with all of that. So, I mean, you can have events with athletes without a crowd. There's one thing, but I don't see the point of an opening ceremony like that. Or then maybe you just do it digitally. I don't know.
Radio. So, just generally speaking, it's a interesting time. So, we've just had the Black Sticks just played a couple games against Australia, men's and women's. Key thing there is that those games, it was a bit of a bummer of a series. Neither team was overly great or fantastic. Kayla Whitelock did her knee, so she's out. But it was just a warm-up phase, and They now go to Australia to play Pro League games. So for Black Sticks hockey, the most important things are the Pro League and the major tournaments, Olympics, World Cups, Commonwealth Games. So if you're I'm going to write something to basically tell the story. We've got a really important double banger coming up in a week or two over in Australia that count towards the Pro League, and that's most important there. So kind of whatever you saw in those tests against Australia, I think they were all in Palmerston North. Just hold on to that loosely. All of that stuff loosely applies because it was kind of just get back into the swing of things and we'll move forward with those Pro League games and then perhaps the Olympics. With the UFC, Israel Adesanya and Brad Riddell from City Kickboxing fight not this coming weekend, the next weekend, I believe. So I'm just kind of, personally, I'm just in it's a bit of a down phase. We've got State of Origin sparking up with the NRL, so there's buys in that game, so it's just taking a little dip at the moment. Lydia Ko, she is playing in the LPGA US Women's Open. That starts tomorrow. I believe that is in San Fran, over in the west side of United States of America. Those are kind of my big things. I am loosely paying attention to the surfing. It's an International Surfing Association event, not necessarily the WSL. And then we have Wellington Phoenix. We've got the Breakers are still battling. We've got Flying Kiwis are still playing football, although a lot of those competitions, some of the American stuff is starting up, though I have seen that, so I assume that's going to take greater prominence for you, Wildcard. So the hockey, the UFC, we can kind of wait until further action there. Most important for me feels like the Wellington Phoenix, as we're getting through this playoff push phase. How do you reflect on the week we just had where they played 3 games in 1 week and looked pretty good? Are you vastly excited that they could get into the finals, or you've got a bit of realism? How are you processing a lot of that Wellington Phoenix business as it does, like on my agenda, on my menu, it is the biggest thing in Kiwi sports at this time, just with how the other sports have laid back for a couple of days here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the 3 games in 8 days that they had, and 7 points, probably needed 9 points, didn't quite get it over the line. Ulysses Davia missing a penalty right at the end of the game against Perth Glory is a difficult one. If they'd scored that, they'd still have their fate in their own hands. Because he didn't, it's quite hard to see them getting there now. It's like, it's not just that, it's also that there's been a couple games since then that have just not gone the way the Phoenix wanted it to go. Needed Western United to take some points off MacArthur, and they didn't. They gave them an almighty little shake-up at the end, but still lost 2-1, couldn't find an equaliser. Brisbane won 2-1 against Perth as well, which is better than Perth winning, but it's still not as good as a draw would have been, which is what we really needed. Which means that later tonight, and it might have even been played by the time most people probably listen to this, is Last Chance Saloon. Like, if Western Sydney Wanderers don't beat Adelaide, then it doesn't matter what the Phoenix do on Friday night against MacArthur, because they'll already have been eliminated. So they absolutely have to see that result go in the other direction. If it does, then I think it's winning they're in the last game. But if it doesn't, I think it has to be let me just whip up the ladder, but I'm pretty sure it has to be a Western Sydney win as well. I don't think a draw does them anything. Adelaide are at home there as well, which isn't very nice. Yeah, Adelaide 3 points ahead of the Phoenix, so they would have to lose that game. Western Sydney not in contention. They're 1 point behind the Phoenix, so they're already out as well, which again doesn't help matters, and that's difficult. Don't need to talk about that any longer for reasons already discussed. There's going to be out of date within a few hours of this podcast going up, but I think it's important to remember the context, and this is what I wrote about most recently with the Phoenix. Like, they're 10 games unbeaten right now. They've been scoring goals, they've been keeping clean sheets, they've been doing what they needed to do. They're like, I think 20 points from those 10 games. There have been 5 draws, and maybe a couple of those draws needed to be wins, and then they would be in prime position to be making a third straight finals appearance. That's not how it happened, but even still, like 20 points over the course of 10 games is, 2 points a game is very close to minor premiers kind of form if you average that out over a full season. Of course, that's not the form they've had over the course of the full season. They started off with some pretty shocking form. I think they won 1 of their first 8 games, and then they had a period after that where they started to find a bit more, started to get a few of those answers, but it was just not, it was too inconsistent. They would win and then they'd lose, and then they'd win and then they'd lose, and it wasn't until this 10-game streak here, which is, a good third of the season, more than that, where they've found the kind of like top playoff type form that can get them to that level, but it just, they've left it a bit too late. And whether they get in from here or not, obviously the fact that we're still sweating it right now is proof that they've left it a bit too late. That's kind of like, it's one of those things with a league season. It's, you have this sort of mentality sometimes that you can sort of like overcome these things and get back to there. But the points you drop at the start of the season are worth just as much as the points you gain at the end of the season. Like, you don't get another opportunity to get them back. And so the Phoenix have been playing catch up since the start because of a poor start. And it's a poor start. There's a few reasons why that might be the case. I mean, obviously there was a bit of a disrupted preseason. The fact that they do not have home games, only had 2 home games, and they're in the last, 2 weeks of the season. That's not ideal. I don't think I mentioned this specifically enough in the article I wrote, but the major factor as well, perhaps more than anything else, because at least they'd had a bit of a taster of the doing, since the restart, they'd had played a few games and they had overseas, that had that sort of like, they had, they did all their preseason over there. They're pretty well set up. It's not the drama. They carried on some poor form from the end of last season. It took them a while to get going, but I think also just the fact that last season they're up, like just before the restart, when they're in their best form, the best football they've been playing under Ufuk Talay. I'd say overall, I think it's still a nudge ahead of what they're doing at the moment, where you had like Tim Payne at right back, Luke DeVere, Stephen Taylor at centre back, Libby Kakache at left back. Obviously, Kakache's gone on to bigger and better things. Tim Payne was playing right back for a lot of those early games. Luke DeVere was playing centre back until he got injured. Stephen Taylor wasn't there, of course. Stephen Taylor's come back, and since he's been in there, he's kind of been the catalyst for the turnaround of their season. And I think a lot of defensive mistakes, a lot of silly goals that they conceded in those first few games, and I think that's maybe the biggest reason why they struggled at the start, was because they didn't have that solidarity or continuation in their backline, and younger guys were asked to step up who maybe didn't quite have it in them to do certainly what Stephen Taylor would do. At the moment, none of that back four is there that they started with, except for Tim Payne sliding into centre back. He's playing a different position, but he's still in the back four. Like, Fenton's come in. Sam Sutton is now playing as the starting left back. Stephen Taylor's returned, and Tim Payne playing centre back. So it's been an ongoing sort of shuffle. It's been an ongoing kind of trying to find the answers, trying to find the combinations, and ultimately it just feels like they probably left the run a little bit too late, and that's where things have kind of come unstuck for the Phoenix. But maybe someone will be listening to this right now after Western Sydney absolutely smoke Adelaide, thinking, well, you guys, you're a little bit pessimistic because everything worked out perfectly in the end and they timed it exactly right. But it shouldn't. They're a better team than a couple of the teams that are directly above them, and the last month or two of form has proven that. They've just, you can't necessarily overcome at least half of a season of just inconsistencies and dropped points. It's a lot of work. And it's one of those things about league football, is it's not like survive in advance kind of knockout football stuff where you just have to get through, you just have to not lose. And in league football, those points all count the same, and you're stuck trying to overcome them and make up for them late in the season. because the start of the season wasn't good enough, and it is definitely one of those things. It's kind of the beauty of league football, I suppose, is that it really does give a reflection of the full season, not just to whichever team finishes in the best form, but like the entire season. Every game is worth just like the same amount of points. And unfortunately for the Phoenix, that's not been to their benefit, and a bit of an inconsistent campaign.
The same can basically be said about the Warriors. First of all, with the results, I think they are doing a bit of the Wellington Phoenix right now and just losing games that they shouldn't be losing, but games they're going to lose because they're going to finish where they're going to finish. And, you could want the Wellington Phoenix to be a lot better and not lose those games at the start of the season, but I also think that there was some adversity there, and there's growth there as well. Like, they worked themselves into an advantageous position moving forward. So I still think you can be pretty positive. The Warriors have lost 2 games to Manly. Both of them, one was by 1 point, and then they lost by 6 points. Could have very easily won both those games. Could have won a game against the Knights very early on in the season. Could have defeated the Cowboys last week. Like, they could have won a lot of these games, and they've also lost a lot of games. I think I counted only 3 games they hadn't conceded 20 points. So you're just never going to be a true blue contender doing that. So I do see some similarities between the Warriors and the Phoenix, just with what you're saying about the league style, like not league as in code, but league as in the competition. Obviously, in rugby league, you're always kind of playing a league, whereas football is a bit spicier in that they do have the different competition formats. The NRL is such a grind, so you can say that, there are ebbs and flows of the season, but when all the chips are equal at the start of the season, you do want to kind of bank those points and bank those wins when you can, especially when you've got a sniff of a win. And I assume there's a bit of, there are good teams in the A-League. So when the Wellington Phoenix did end up playing a good team, you do want to kind of know that you can lose that game. You can try your hardest and lose, and it's all good because you did grab every win possible that you could at the start of the season. And I think those cross over. It was interesting you said the back 4 with the Phoenix, Wellington, because Wildcard. I called you Wellington. Meant to call you Wildcard, but I think I might just call you Wellington from now on. The back 4 Wellington of the Wellington Phoenix, did you say that it was the start of last season or the start of this season that was completely different?
Both. The start of this season to now is there's only one player who's in the sort of like the starting back 4 from the first 4, 5, 6 games, I think it was, up until De Vere got injured, and that's when they had to start changing things. So like Josh Laws isn't starting anymore. James McGarry's playing off the bench. Tim Payne is still starting, but he's starting at centre back, so in a different position. De Vere's injured, obviously, so that's changed. But also, like, I think the best back 4 they had during Talai's time was just before the restart, because obviously Tim Payne didn't play after the restart, but he was first suspended and then injured. So, but leading up to that point, when they were, I have the thing here somewhere where they were in a just sizzling form. Like, I think they'd won, directly leading up to the restart, they won 4 games in a row. And you had in the last 3 of those games, because Payne had 1 game out with a suspension, you had Payne at right back, Taylor and De Vere in the middle, Kakache on the left. So that's also completely different. Like, the back 4 from the start of this season to now is completely different. The back 4 from the peak of last season to the start of this season was also almost completely different. So it's a half similar, but one of those guys got injured and one ended up playing a different position after a while. So, yeah, the continuity in general, like, it's not just the one thing, it's throughout the time. This has been a little bit of an issue for a team that can concede some sloppy goals, particularly when Stephen Taylor isn't around to sort of like be the leader and the guy who tells everyone, make sure that they're in the right place and whatnot.
So the round 1 of the NRL season, New Zealand Warriors take on Gold Coast Titans, and their backline, their back 5, the back 4, back 5, the Warriors back 5, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck at fullback, David Pusatura on the wing, Ewan Aitken at centre, Peter Hiku at centre, Ken Mamalo on the wing. The Cowboys game, 11 rounds later, almost 3 months or whatever, who knows, many months later, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck and Ewan Aitken are still in the backline, but Ewan Aitken is the only player playing in the same position. Against the Cowboys, Reece Walsh comes in at fullback, Marcelo Montoya is on the wing, Adam Pompey's at centre, Ewan Aitken at centre, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck as a winger. So, from round 1 to round 12, Ewan Aitken is the only player playing in the same position, let alone playing. Well, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck's still playing, but Ewan Aitken's the only one in the same position. Which, like, we can get into what it means, like how difficult sport is, and dealing with combinations. I just find it absolutely crazy. And that sort of stuff, what it means is just context around what we're dealing with and how the team's performing. The forward pack against the Titans, Fanua Blake, Tanua Brown, Sirinen, Harris, who started lock there? So Katoa, Sirinen, and Harris. Against the Cowboys, no Fanua Blake, Tanua Brown's still there, and Katoa's still playing on an edge. Harris is still there. So there's less changeover, but you still have a little bit. But the back lines. The back line of the Wellington Phoenix is completely different end of season to start of season. The back line for the Warriors is completely different mid-season to the start of the season. And it's a combination. What makes it funny is that it's a combination. Like, you got a wide variety of reasons. David Fusatua hasn't played. He's played like 4 games this season. Don't really know what's happening there. Peter Hiku, long-term injury, maybe. There was some sort of injury. Ken Mamalo did play. Peter Hiku only played 4 games as well, 4 or 5 games. Ken Mamalo did play 10 games, so he's in a different circumstance. Roger Tuivasa-Sheck moves to the wing, which is a different circumstance. And then Reece Walsh, a blockbuster, semi-mid-season signing. So it's just a mess of a situation, and it's a kerfuffle for a variety of reasons, but it's still kind of cool just to see how that happens and how it's happening for the same, like, Wellington Phoenix and New Zealand Warriors.
Yeah, and leading to pretty similar results too, where you highlighted the comparisons there between, like, playing well but not quite well enough, and maybe not quite being your own best ally in terms of avoiding silly mistakes that can end up costing you games in close contests like that. And the other factor about Ewan Aitken, I was going to say I guess Ewan Aitken is Tim Payne then, but maybe not, because the other thing about Ewan Aitken is he might be the consistent guy between then and now, but in between he obviously had was it an ankle injury or something? He missed about a month and a half of footy, so he himself was out for a while before coming back in to retain that same position. So even then, it's a bit of a juggling act, and I guess that's probably a wider sporting lesson of one of those things where if you, like, so much, I think about this a lot in terms of football. I think it's the same in most team sports. Like, so much of how, like, the process of being successful on the field comes down to good combinations within a team. Like, it's not just a good overall team, but like combinations within that. So in a footballing sense, you're talking like a fullback who understands how their winger works and vice versa, and so they know how to work an overlap. A midfielder who knows when to slide over and create an overload in those areas, or when to make a late run into the box to attack a cross or something like that. Like, it's an understanding of how your teammates play and being able to play in combination with them like that. And you just don't get that when you don't get you only get that by playing regularly and consistently with those guys, because there's just like little tricks of the trade. This guy likes to maybe in a rugby league contest, this guy likes to step on the outside or something. So if he's playing on the wing, maybe I need to get a little bit closer or something, or run the inside channels and try get an offload or a pass back in the field. If he's going to be in trouble with the sideline, or all these tiny little things that aren't even major aspects, but they can have major outcomes. Because if you understand these things, then you get that tiny little advantage, which leads to something bigger. And yeah, just chopping and changing of teams, this is why that can be a difficult thing. And the Phoenix had a lot of injuries too. It's not like Talai was just getting impatient and dropping a bunch of players over and over and over and over. It was enforced most of the time. A couple suspensions as well. There were 2 red cards in those sort of like the downswing at the start of the season, and those things can tally up and make it very difficult for you. But over the course of a season, you will have that. In a league season where you play a lot of games, you will have sort of like months at a time where you just cannot get even close to picking your best team, and you have to find a way to get results when you're not playing that well, which is always the thing that they say about the best teams can do that. And the Wellington Phoenix just didn't quite ground out enough of those wins and draws in the first half of their season, and it is definitely catching up with them now. But it's also, they've got a pretty young team. It's hopeful that a lot of these, Ulysses Davy is gone. Surely they can re-sign Stephen Taylor, who himself is basically saying, "Please keep me. I don't want to leave again. I'm happy with, I'm happy where I am." And considering the impact we've just seen of like how much he means to this team, how much better they instantly got when he returned, like that's a big deal. You got Ollie Sale, who's locked himself in as a pretty excellent goalkeeper at this level based on what we've seen from him so far. Like there's a lot of young players and a lot of players who'll get Clayton Lewis's rise as well, and he's re-signed. There's a few more that need to sign contracts. There's definitely a couple guys coming off contract that would prefer that they weren't, but they've got a good spine to build from moving forward. And if they can keep Stephen Taylor, hopefully they avoid having a similar slump to start the season, because they had, I think they lost their first 4 games in a row when Uffy first took over. So it was a not as extended a trend, but it was also a trend of a slow start that season as well. And you can't be doing that every year. So hopefully with a bit more continuity, the young team getting better and got a solid spine to build from and build around, they should be better off for this next time. And maybe they'll still get lucky and make the finals. But you also, at this point, whether you're making the finals or not, at this point of the season, you still already have to be thinking about next time. And there are some plenty of good signs in the way they've played over the last 2 months suggests that they've definitely got a playoff worthy ceiling to them, especially considering Ulysses Davia missed a couple of those games too. So the fact that he's leaving hopefully won't impact that too negatively. We'll need to find a creative import player to replace him, but there's an entire world to look in to find one of those. It's doable. There's definitely plenty of reasons for optimism about the way the Phoenix are going. They made the finals the last 2 years. If they don't make it this year, well, there's still a good reason to feel like they can make it next year.
One slither of a reason for optimism for the Warriors could be just having Cody Nikarima and Chanel Harris-Tavita as well as Wade Egan just playing rugby league together. Now, Harris-Tavita did miss a few games, but Wade Egan's had a decent crack at hooker, and Nikarima's just played in the halves. Other than a brief experimental section with Reece Walsh coming into the team where he did a bit of hooker, I think. Like, just having those dudes play the same position as often as possible with injuries and suspension, I think it's hugely beneficial, especially when I don't know how many of those combinations with the Wellington Phoenix have been year on year on year. Like, again, compounding where it's okay, we've got a bit of a rhythm going this season. Whoa, we've got a whole off season to work together. So now we've got a better rhythm, better flow the second season. And that just builds and builds. Then you get another off season and it builds and builds. Like, that doesn't seem like it's been part of the Wellington Phoenix. And it's
No,
definitely...
it doesn't. But hopefully next year is the start of that, get some continuity. I mean, the last, 3 years, basically, the Phoenix have had to rebuild at least half of their squad, so you're never going to get continuity that way.
Yeah, and even then, it's like you're kind of meaning like the first off season coming up. Like, where there's some teams around the world where they are in year 5 or year 6 of their combination, let alone, Melbourne Storm, and you're dealing in a decade of a combination and just how beneficial that is. So I think for the Warriors, there's been a lot of different halves combinations used. And what we're saying in the Patreon Almost Daily podcast, like now you've got Devin Conway in the batting lineup. Don't even worry about thinking of him coming into Ross Taylor's position, forcing Ross Taylor out. No. Just leave him opening. Because then you've got a world-class batting lineup, and maybe it's like a case of the rising tide bringing up all the ships, so players who are out of form don't... Because Ross Taylor definitely looks out of form, but he looks less out of form if the Black Caps are winning, and other blokes are scoring runs, and it's a cool environment to be in. You can fiddle around with Reece Walsh all you want, but also at some point you just want a halves combination that is rock solid and has... Because at least Chanel Harris-Tavita and Cody Nikorima have maybe... they've been at the Warriors together for a number of years now. Well, not a number, maybe 2. I think Nikorima joined more recently. Yeah, 2 is a good number. I like 2. 2's the lucky number. I think that was a De La Soul song. Maybe The Roots. Probably De La Soul. So at least they are building something. The worst thing the Warriors could do is chuck Reece Walsh into the halves, and then he has to adapt to a whole new halves combination when we've just gone through that for the last 10 years. How about you just leave Cody Nikorima and Chanel Harris-Tavita to just learn how to be NRL halves, let them figure it out together. Hopefully they can do so with the bloke who's passing them the ball, Wade Egan, who is just churning out games, and I can only see that being beneficial as well. Then you integrate. How do we best use Reece Walsh into that mix? How do we bring him in for certain plays? What does he like to do? What does he not like to do? All those little combination stuff that you were alluding to before. I think we can, having talked around it across a couple of different sports here, we can get a bit too tricky. We can get in, how do we fit all these pieces together when we're kind of both saying there's an intrinsic benefit to the same dudes having many repetitions and allowing them time and space to build those combinations, get those reps in, and work on some of those things that become instinct, become intuition, that help you win games. Because if we're thinking, why aren't the Warriors and Phoenix winning consistently? Some of it is the fact that they don't have any of these intuitive combinations. They don't have dudes who can cover defensively without having to communicate. They don't have the Reece Walsh is going to pop up on my right hip every single time, so I don't have to think, so I can just give him the pass and everything's a touch quicker. And suddenly he's bursting through the gap as opposed to being slowed down or tackled. Neither team really has those, and the Breakers probably don't have it as well, although they do have the Webster connection. They do have Abercrombie and a bit of a Tall Blacks connection around that. I think to the hockey I watched, and there's a lot of moving pieces in those squads, in both squads, that I don't feel are conducive to the benefits of intuition and instinct and combination, cohesion, working together. Are there any other examples that you feel fit that mold?
Well, you kind of made the transition there that I was about to, which is I think the Breakers are absolutely even more so than either of the teams that we've been talking about. I think they're an absolutely perfect example of this idea because they have done just so much chopping and changing throughout the season where it's mostly injury based. But like, at what point? How do players just keep getting injured? It's nuts. Like, they had a massive injury problems in the first half of last season as well. Like, I don't know who the physios are at this club, but they seem to have an ongoing problem with injuries, and it's not just that. Like, Rob Lowe had a couple months out of the team for personal reasons, and there was some murkiness around that with some of the responses to that, I felt, but he came back, played a few games, then got injured, which is the state of it. Both Webster brothers have had injury dramas throughout the season. Their star import turned up just like horribly out of shape and was just not ready to be the player they needed him to be, and that turned out to be a disastrous sign. They let him go halfway through, bring in a new import, Levi Randolph, who's a pretty handy player. If they'd had him from the start, I think they'd be in a much better position than they are, but trying to adapt on the fly during the middle of the season is not ideal. Their depth has not been good enough. Their signings, guys like Dan Trist and Rasmus Back can do a few things. He's okay. He's big energy and whatever. But Trist has been poor for them. Kyron Galloway is just not. He's pretty average. He's pretty fresh. He's not really contributing massively well. It did take Colton Iverson quite a month or so to get into the swing of things himself. He's settled in nicely after that, but he actually has been one of their main consistents. But for a while there, he was basically the only import player, and they bought a guy who would just do a job that you don't necessarily need an import to do, just to rebound and be a big man, run to the rim now and then, finish from close range. It's not exactly a wild skill set that you need to cast the net far and wide to find someone to fit that job description. So it's not like the injuries are the main thing, but it's not just that. I think they also left themselves vulnerable to injuries by not having a very deep squad with guys who could contribute, where you have like that, the phrase you used, intuitive combinations, I think it was what you said. Like, yes, there are some with the Tall Blacks guys for the Breakers, but not enough to overcome the fact that this has just looked like a clunky team, and Dan Shamir has changed his rotations basically night to night, and a lot of that is out of his control. Some of it I just think is him tinkering a bit too much, and I don't know that he's got strategies that have been coming through in a positive light for this team. I think they play a little bit too much like him trying to bring the style of basketball that he coached in Israel to a different league where there are different standards, and I think probably you would say the overall quality of imports across the league would be higher in Israel, but the overall quality of domestic players is higher in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand for one thing, but especially Australia, where how many Aussie guys do you have in the NBA these days? They're a team that at major tournaments like the Olympics coming up will be backing themselves to compete for medals, and not just bronze medals either, but get into a final and maybe even trying to win that thing. You can't necessarily play that kind of way. Like the styles don't really translate where you can just like give the ball to your best player and expect everyone else to like post up on the edges, hit their threes if it comes to them, but like you've got the one guy who can really lead the show. And you had Ty Webster doing just way too much of that at the start of the season, so I think there's definitely issues when it comes to the coaching aspects. And I do wonder, they extended him last year midway through when he still had a losing record and it was looking pretty average, and I don't know why they did that at that point, but there is an interesting, I don't think they'll sack him, but I do think if they wanted to, there is a case to say, and I like Dan Shamir. I think he's actually, the most exciting thing about him is how refreshing he is, because he's like, for a team whose PR stuff, like, and the media is just PR at this point, like, most teams are like this. This isn't the Breakers exclusive thing, where the Breakers tend to go a little bit further than others. Like, they're like only accentuating the positives and like putting this sort of like frustrating spin on things, and then the Twitter account is just a meme factory now and that kind of stuff. Like, for considering all that coming from that environment, it's always quite fun to hear Dan Shamir do a press conference, and there was or just like a halftime interview or something. They'll be like, "So what do you think needs to change?" And after that first half, and he'll just say everything. We were terrible. We sucked, and it's like no one else is saying this out of the Breakers. I kind of respect the coach for going out on a limb like that. He is a fellow who will tell it how it is if he needs to. He's relatively blunt, but his coaching record has been crap for the team over 2 years. He's going to miss the playoff both times. They're 1 game to go this season, and they've got to win that to have any hope of not finishing second to last. It's for a team that was talked up in preseason as having a championship contention caliber roster. This has been absolutely disastrous, and I think a lot of that combinations, a lot of those rotational stuff definitely comes into account when you're wondering why things have been the way that they have been. All the stuff we were just talking about with the Warriors and the Phoenix, I think the Breakers take that to an extreme level and have had the extreme results from that. That's what you get. They're losing 2 out of every 3 games because they don't even look like the same team from week to week. It's weird, and it's just been the story of their season. On that note, what are your thoughts on this fella, Ousmane Dieng, this French teenager that they've grabbed up as their next star for next season, and building up all the big hypes and whatnot, and the next RJ Hampton type thing? He's a fella who's almost certain to go in the first round of not this year's NBA draft, but after a season with the Breakers, the one after that. So in it, 14 months or whatever it is when that comes around. It does have. There are a couple of things where I think they've learnt the lesson. Like, they've obviously not signed a point guard this time. Not going to just chuck the reins of the team to a teenager who hasn't played at this level at all before. However, Matt Walsh was all over the promo stuff about this and chucking in quotes and talking about like how inspiring this is going to be for young kids in Auckland who want to go to the NBA one day, and they're seeing the example of someone who probably will, and like this is what you can achieve and all these kind of things. And then the marketing side of things, and getting Adrian Wojnarowski tweeting about the Breakers, and it's on ESPN and all this stuff, and how exciting this is, the interactions and whatever. But then the thing you notice that no one mentioned is how does this complement the idea of winning games of basketball? Because it doesn't, and we saw that with RJ Hampton, it doesn't. So what are you feeling about that? Like, we're going back down the old, the big hype next star, it's not the road not traveled, it's the road already traveled. We're traveling down that same road again. Do you have inklings that this might go the same way as the last one did as well?
I just don't know if I care as much. But I think the last one was a bit different because it was like I just don't think it's going to have any impact on the Breakers at all. Like, because Kiwis aren't going to know who he is. There's no the only reason people really cared about the last round of these signings was LaMelo Ball. If RJ Hampton had done it by himself, it wouldn't have had the same impact. But because he and LaMelo Ball do it, there's so many more eyeballs on what's happening. And, like, if they're doing it to try and make a splash, there's zero splash here. There's zero splash. It is like, the cool thing is that it's an alternative, and I don't mind the Breakers being an alternative to the NCAA, because like, who actually likes the NCAA other than the Kiwis who benefit from it, like sporting wise and whatever educational stuff they get, or is this Stephen Adams' lack of educational stuff that you get in college in America? Yeah, I just don't. Like the Breakers could be. Here we go. I think I talked my way through to the nugget, and we don't even need to go much longer than this. But if you compare what the Warriors, their modus operandi right now, to the Breakers, the Warriors, like Phil Gould, understandably, flatly rejected any approach from the Bulldogs because he wants to help rugby league in New Zealand. And it's so much more, I've been thinking about this a lot, it's so much more than the Warriors. Like, people have to open up. Phil Gould is here to help rugby league in New Zealand, because in New Zealand, the Warriors didn't necessarily work with Auckland Rugby League, and Auckland Rugby League and the Warriors didn't necessarily work with New Zealand Rugby League, let alone New Zealand Māori Rugby League, let alone the Pacific nations who have like junior teams in Aotearoa. Like, there's tournaments where you've got Tonga under 13s facing Niue under 13s, facing Cook Islands under 13s, facing any other culture who wants to have a rugby league team. Those events happen, but they don't necessarily happen in alignment. And that is why Phil Gould is here, because he sees that he can have an impact on that alignment through the Warriors, and I believe he got placed to work with the Warriors to then help the alignment of rugby league in New Zealand. And if there's an alignment of rugby league in New Zealand, naturally, given that Auckland is the Polynesian capital of the world, that is going to have a flow-on effect to the Pacific Islands, as well as the work you do and the resources you invest in the Pacific Islands and New Zealand. That's very different to what the Breakers are doing. The Breakers seem very keen to bring on people from overseas just to help the Breakers, as opposed to moving forward and helping basketball in New Zealand in the best way possible. I don't want to say too much more about that, because I just don't know what I'm talking about here. I'm just kind of speaking off the top of the dome. Does that connect or resonate in any way?
Yes, definitely, entirely. I mean, I'm reminded of the fact that none of the Breakers players were, it's not that they weren't released, it's that they were just sort of encouraged not to partake in the NBL showdown last year. I'm not sure who signed up for this year, but I think in general, because of the crossover, I think most of the NBL proper contracted players, a few of the ones on development deals and things like that will pop up in NBL stuff before the end of the Kiwi season there, but not a lot of the overall guys. So it's not just the Breakers in that situation, but it will be a similar trend. And yeah, like Usmani Dieng comes in, and does this benefit New Zealand basketball? I mean, it might benefit the culture of New Zealand basketball, the getting fan interest and stuff like that. But I mean, I think it was pretty telling what you said. The first thing your first reaction was don't really care. And I think in relation to the last time this happened, and it is a relation to the last time this happened, because the RJ Hampton thing, a lot of hype, a lot of interest. I don't know if we ever seen that documentary. When they filming him, didn't they have a film crew around? I don't know if that ever got finished or whatever. But a lot of buzz, not a lot of flash for the cash. He struggled to have a major impact on the court. Was asked to do too much for his relative inexperience. Couple injuries. He left halfway through, and no one even really cared at that point. So it was definitely, I think your point about LaMelo was definitely a bigger one, because that's where most of the interest came from, and the Breakers got a lot of flow-on effect, like the cup overfilleth kind of stuff. That's not really the case right now, and this guy, I mean, you've seen NBA drafts same as I have. The overseas guys, like the French guy with the funny accent sort of thing, as far as an American is concerned, is always underrated when it comes to the NBA draft. Like, Luka Doncic went third, I think it was, in his one, and he's clearly the best. And no disrespect to the likes of, was it second? And I think Atlanta traded down or something. I don't know, but no disrespect to Trae Young, who's outstanding, or DeAndre Ayton, who's coming into his own now. Both excellent players. But Luka Doncic is a generational player, and that multiple teams sort of thought, I don't know about this guy. Is all the evidence you need that this continues to happen. That there's always, and Giannis Antetokounmpo won back-to-back MVPs. He was drafted behind Steven Adams at 15 or 16 or something like that year. Rudy Gobert is one of the, he's already put in a case that he's one of the best defensive players of all time. drafted at about 29th or something, and I think he's one of those guys who can name every single player who got drafted ahead of him, one of whom, again, is Steven Adams. It's weird that notoriously terrible draft that he went in actually has a couple of the very best players in the league, but they went low. Like, they were just underestimated. So maybe the draft wasn't as bad as it appeared. It's just that nobody could scout properly. But like, Dieng is not going to create a big splash in America the way that even RJ Hampton didn't really. I mean, he got drafted a lot lower than people thought he would. Definitely a lot lower than we were led to believe when the Breakers first brought him in there. None of that reflects particularly well on the ideas of how, like, the ceiling, the upside of what the Breakers might get out of a move like this. But if he's not going to be a distraction to the team, and if he's going to be able to contribute in a few ways, he is pretty tall, he's pretty athletic by the sounds of it, he's can play a couple different positions. If he can at least, contribute something either on the offensive or defensive end, then there's nothing wrong with it. It gives them flexibility with how they bring in their imports, because he doesn't count as one of those. So all that's nice, but you get the feeling that's not the reason that they went for this. Like, you get the feeling that the Breakers want another big splash. They want to be a team that gets talked about on ESPN. And I just don't know that that's what they're going to get out of this.
Well, hopefully the listeners have got something out of this episode of the Nichecast. We will be back early next week with another episode of The Variety Show. And of course, there'll be another episode of the Almost Daily Black Caps podcast coming up at some point as well. Big it up to yourself. Kia kaha. Stay beautiful. Chur chur.